A Russian scientist walks into a windowless room with the hope of finding his human test subjects in there safe and sound. Instead, chaos engulfs the scene. Terrifying screams fill the air, and right in front of him lies a mutilated body. The scene is like something straight out of a horror film. Even the survivors bear brutal wounds, with pieces of flesh torn from their arms and legs. Their bones peek through their exposed fingertips, and their faces are stripped of skin. This researcher starts to think that maybe this experiment wasn't such a good idea after all. Hi folks, I'm Johnny and welcome to the Oddest. Hold on tight, because we're diving headfirst into a twisted rollercoaster of science gone wild. Get ready to unlock the mind-bending mystery of the Russian sleep experiments, where creepy experiments meet terrifying consequences. Brace yourselves folks, because it's going to be crazy. So, the scary story I told you at the beginning is actually based on the infamous Russian sleep experiment. Let's start from the beginning. So, it's the late 1940s and scientists in the Soviet Union have created a special drug that they think can keep a person awake for a really long time, which is useful during times of war. In World War II, the Germans had their own version of such a drug called Pervitin, which was a powerful methamphetamine. The Americans and the British would give their soldiers a similar amphetamine called Benzedrine, kind of like a regular type of speed that you might hear about. The Soviets want to take things a wee step further and use their own version of a drug that won't lead to a total breakdown after just 3 days of using it. The mad scientists in the lab have made something unique, but they need to test it on people first. Finding test subjects isn't difficult because, well, there was plenty of prisoners of war in the 1940s, and when it came to prisoners, ethical considerations weren't really a big concern. They set up an area where 5 subjects will stay. It's a sealed environment where the researchers can release the drug as gas and check if the oxygen levels are okay. The subjects have been given dried food, a bed without any bedding, and access to running water and a toilet. The researchers use a microphone to listen to the subjects, while cameras allow them to keep an eye on them. The only way to see outside is through a thick glass window, but they're not very clear. See, at the start I mentioned that the room was windowless. Well, it kinda was. There was a small porthole type window. The stage was set and the 5 guys seemed pretty happy during the first 3 days. The gas that they've been given is working, which makes the researchers fairly happy. The subjects agreed to stay awake for 30 days, thinking that they'll earn their freedom if they make it. Seemed like a fair deal to them. Things start getting creepy around day 4, when the subjects begin talking about war and the terrifying things that they've witnessed. They mention traumas, constant nightmares, and all sorts of gruesome stuff that they saw. Day 5 arrives and it gets even worse. The guys start acting crazy, talking to themselves and to things that aren't even there. They grow suspicious of each other and start whispering into the microphone, telling stories about the other subjects. I mean, that kinda sounds like an episode of Big Brother. The researchers were well aware of the effects of sleep deprivation. After 5 days, a person's mind can start playing tricks on them, leading to terrifying hallucinations. However, they couldn't help but wonder if it was the lack of sleep or the gas itself that was causing these effects. The suspicions about the gas became even stronger on day 9, when one of the guys suddenly went into a screaming fit. He howled like a banshee, running frantically around the room. The screaming was so intense that it seemed to damage his vocal cords. Eventually, his cries just turned into high-pitched squeaks, almost like a child's toy. As a few more days passed, an eerie silence settled in. The men couldn't be seen on the camera, but the oxygen levels indicated that all 5 were still breathing. Where were they? The researchers had been hesitant to interrupt the study, but now they felt that they had no choice. They spoke into the intercom, saying,
"We are opening the chamber to check the microphones. Move away from the door and lie flat on the floor or you will be shot. If you comply, one of you will be granted immediate freedom."
They heard a single whispering voice respond, "We don't want to be free anymore." What was going on? Had they become addicted to that gas and lost their minds? The researchers realised there was nothing else they could do but open the door. They also opened the vents to allow fresh air to replace the lingering effects of the stimulant. What happened next was chilling. The men started screaming again, begging for more of the gas. On day 15, the researchers decided to open the doors again, and to their surprise, they discovered that one man had died. You already know about the gruesome scene that I described earlier, but I didn't mention what happened just shortly after the horrifying discovery of the partially eaten man and the injured survivors. Upon closer examination, the researchers noticed that the wounds on the men were severe and appeared to be self-inflicted. They had torn open their own chests, exposing the horrifying sight of their lungs. It seemed that each man had performed this grotesque surgery on himself. They had removed functioning blood vessels and laid out their internal organs on the floor as if it was some kind of twisted artwork, and it seemed like the goal was to eat them. They were devouring their own bodies, and it seemed they were getting excited by this. The scientists called for help, but were too scared to approach those unfortunate souls. So they shut the door while the men begged for the gas to be returned. When soldiers arrived to assist in removing the subjects, it wasn't a pleasant task. One of the subjects violently tore out a man's throat, and another soldier had his private parts removed. In total, 5 soldiers lost their lives, and some of the victims took their own lives afterwards. Once the subjects were finally out, the doctors injected them with a strong sedative, but the men continued to fight like wild animals. One subject bled out and his heart stopped, yet he continued to scream,
"Give me gas. I need gas."
Even a doctor had some of his bones broken during this horrifying spectacle. The other 3 subjects were eventually sedated, restrained and relocated to a secure facility. They reluctantly admitted that maybe the Germans, the Brits and the Americans were right in providing their troops with powerful stimulants. The surgeons began their work, attempting to put back the missing organs and pieces of tissue in one man, but he nearly broke free from his restraints. Eventually the doctors managed to administer anaesthesia, but the man's heart stopped and he died right then and there. The autopsy would later reveal that he had broken 9 bones and suffered extensive muscle tears throughout his entire body. When they proceeded to treat the next man, the surgeons decided that 2 deaths were enough and opted not to use any anaesthesia this time. They skillfully patched him up, repairing his damaged organs and applying skin grafts. The head surgeon acknowledged that this man should not be alive after enduring such trauma, yet he couldn't help but admire his own work. A nurse mentioned that during the surgery, the man had been smiling at her, which made her wonder how primal instincts could still function in the midst of such horrors. The guy was almost dead, and he still managed to flirt with the nurse. Suddenly, the man started wheezing, as if attempting to communicate something. The observant nurse handed him a pen and held a notepad beneath it. The man wrote only 2 words. As for the other maniac, he laughed like a hyena during his own bodily reconstruction. He repeatedly expressed his desire for the gas, the strong stuff. When asked why, he simply stated that he needed to stay awake. Then, a former KGB agent had a brilliant idea that somehow eluded everyone else. Why not just put these unfortunate guys back in the gas? Just pop them back into that room and turn the valve. That makes sense. Once they were back in the room and on the gas, everything seemed fine and dandy. However, something strange occurred. The EEG monitor displayed chaotic brain activity that eventually quietened down. One man's heart stopped completely. The last dose of the drug had taken its toll. Or so it seemed. The remaining individual returned to the room along with 3 other researchers, where the supposedly deceased man lay on a bed. Suddenly, one of the researchers pulled out a gun and shot the commander, and then turned the gun on the subject. He shouted,
"I won't be trapped here with these things. Not with you. What are you? I need to know."
Surprisingly, the subject, who had just been shot but was evidently not dead, responded,
"Have you forgotten so easily? We are you. We are the madness that lurks within you all, waiting to be free at every moment in your deepest animal mind. We are what you hide from in your beds every night. We are what you sedate into silence and paralysis when you go to the nocturnal haven where we cannot tread."
It seemed like the end, but just to be sure, the researcher fired a bullet into the man's chest, which may have violated the Hippocratic Oath to some extent, but desperate times call for desperate measures. The end. I mean, That's pretty crazy, right? But here's the thing, it's not even true. This story had been doing the rounds online for the longest time, but it turns out it's nothing more than a creepy short story that was posted online. It's evident upon reading this disastrous short story that the writer's grammar skills needed some improvement. Not only that, but the story itself lacks coherence at times. Several instances occur where someone dies and then miraculously comes back to life, and it doesn't seem intentional on the part of the storyteller. It's just as if they have forgotten what they have previously mentioned. In one part, the writer states that the oxygen levels indicated that the men were alive, and the researchers were fully aware of this. Yet in the next part, it's mentioned that the researchers were unsure if the men had actually died. However, it's not just poor writing that reveals these flaws. So let's dive into it. Firstly, it's important to mention that you just can't rip out vital organs and place them on the floor like you're building Legos. That's just pure fiction. Those men would have died due to severe blood loss or shock. Remember, they were discovered in such a state and left unattended for some time before the soldiers arrived. Now, fair enough, you might argue that it was just the effect of the gas at work. This secret experiment gone wrong suggests that under the influence of that sinister drug, men could miraculously return from the dead, tear out their own organs, and even engage in flirting if the mood struck them. But how can we be certain that this story isn't actually true? Well, when we consider recorded history and plausible science, it becomes clear that the claims made in this story lack any credibility. No gas has ever been discovered that can keep a person awake for 15 days, let alone transform them into self-mutilating zombies. Also, there's no mention of such an experiment in any reliable historical sources. The only references to it can be found on a website known for publishing fictional and scary stories. It would be quite, as mentioned in the story, it is true that many soldiers on all sides of the war resorted to stimulants to stay awake for long periods. I mean, that's just historical fact. Officers often distributed these substances among the troops, but even the most dedicated user of such drugs could not remain awake for 15 days. In reality, heavily buzzed soldiers would typically manage around 24 to 36 hours of wakefulness at most. The Pentagon has conducted studies on this subject, and it has been observed that when individuals are forced to stay awake for more than 48 hours, their cognitive abilities decline significantly, rendering them slow and largely ineffective, especially as soldiers. They make numerous mistakes, which is far from ideal in the context of warfare, where constant alertness is crucial. While it is true that the use of stimulants provided an advantage to the Germans during their blitzkrieg attacks, these drugs had to be administered with caution. Given these considerations, it's highly unlikely that the Russians would have attempted such a wild experiment. There is a condition known as Morvin's syndrome that can cause severe confusion and extreme difficulty sleeping. People with this syndrome may experience dreamlike states, even without proper sleep, due to brief episodes of microsleep. However, it's important to note that individuals with this condition have never shown a tendency to start eating themselves. While it is true that exposure to a toxic substance in a confined space could potentially be fatal, it is highly unlikely to turn people into gas-addicted zombies. There's no scientific evidence supporting any aspects of this experiment. Another condition that can cause significant sleep loss is fatal familial insomnia. But this disorder is inherited through genes and it's not caused by environmental factors. Once again, it does not and will never make someone desire to tear out their own organs and eat them. So there you have it, folks. A creepy story for sure, but it's just a story. Thanks for watching. I appreciate you all. Stay safe out there and remember, keep smiling.